mobile computing. In this nugget, we address quite a few different separate topics, so I kind of just, lumped them all together here under mobile computing. Here we'll start off talking about BitLocker to protect data on your hard drive as well as data on USB flash drives or removable drives. We take a look also at offline files as a great way to keep track of your data even when you're not connected to the file server. We'll take a look also at transparent caching, which is something that does not require any user intervention, but will make files more readily available and the performance of those files a little bit faster in terms of accessing them from a local cache as opposed to over the network. And then we'll conclude here by taking a look at the various options for power configuration and mobility settings. When I was a teenager back in junior high, I had an older sister who went to the drugstore and bought herself one of those paper diaries with a little metal lock on it. It's not like today where we put our diaries on the internet back on Facebook and Twitter and whatnot, so everybody knows your private business. Back then it actually used to be private business, and you wouldn't want people to know some of those things. So she would write every night in this little diary that she had purchased. Well, being an enterprising and curious young teenager, one day when she was out of the house, I decided that it was going to be my job to open up that diary, because after all, no one should keep secrets from the family. So I fashioned together a paperclip and was able to pick the lock on that diary and open it up. I didn't actually even read anything. I just wanted to know if I could really pretty much just open it up. So when my sister came home, I went to a great deal of animated expression in telling her how I was able to pick the lock on her diary. Well, she didn't even know that I didn't know anything that was in it. But I'll tell you, from that point on, during our whole teenage years, I was never one to lose an argument. Because any time that she would get in a disagreement with me, I would just give her that knowing look that's communicated to her, I know what's in your diary, and you should be ashamed. Even though I didn't know a thing about it. So I was able to really successfully leverage that all through my teenage years. My sister hasn't spoken to me in years. I'm not quite sure what she's up to these days. But anyway, at least at that time, I was able to get into her diary. Well, certainly, I probably shouldn't have done that. But I do know that we have a need sometimes for privacy. And this could have to do with corporate business. It could have to do with personal business. A lot of different kinds of things. And so there's definitely a need for something on our computers nowadays, which are very often our kind of our personal diaries as well as our corporate diaries, that we need to protect. And you can certainly do that with BitLocker. Now this actually debuted in Windows Vista, and it's the usefulness of this is mostly for portable kinds of devices such as laptops and also thumb drives, which is something that we can also use, something called BitLocker to go. We'll talk about that later. But Dell estimates that about 12,000 laptops are lost or stolen daily. That's a staggering number. Probably a lot of that happens in airports, as you can see, because there's another report that says that there are about 637,000 laptops left behind or stolen each year in major airports. That's based on a Ponemon Institute survey. So certainly there's got to be something secret, either personal or corporate, on some of this stuff. And a lot of folks, they don't really have any concept of security. Most of these are end users, not technical folks like you and I that understand something about security. So a lot of those secrets are just going to be left wide open for anybody to access. These are vulnerable. The vulnerability there really is to what we call an offline attack. This means that, let's say I'm a thief and I've stolen your laptop. Well, I really don't know your password, and I'm not going to take a lot of time trying to guess it or something like that. It's really kind of a waste of time to do that. So what I'll do is I'll just take the hard drive out of your laptop, plug it into an adapter, like an external USB adapter that I can plug it into my desktop computer. I'll take ownership of that hard drive. And then I can change permissions, I can read it, I can do whatever I want to. It can be done from another OS if I want. It could be another Windows OS, or it could even be Linux, it could be Macintosh, whatever. I pretty much have full access to the entire contents of your drive. And if I don't want to fiddle with permissions or anything like that, a lot of what you can do with these things is just to copy them to your own hard drive or some other location where the permissions will be revised to whatever that it inherits on the destination. So this is just a wide open attack, very easy to do, and really is no obstacles whatsoever, even with NTFS permissions. Now EFS, the encrypting file system, will still protect those files that you have decided to encrypt. But very often people don't actually use it because, number one, a lot of corporations are still gun shy of EFS. They're afraid that something will get encrypted that they can never get back. And number two, users just don't know about it. So that's an issue. Also, you can dispose of the hard drive in a legitimate scenario. Let's say that you've got some older computers, you don't have any use for them anymore. Maybe they're even too old and decrepit to give away to schools or charities or something like that. So now you need to dispose of these things, and how are you going to do that? Well, if you have confidential data on those hard drives, a lot of times they still wind up in a landfill or still wind up someplace where someone could pick them up and determine some useful information off of them. But with BitLocker, what you can do is you can just apply BitLocker to those hard drives, and then you can just throw them away or do whatever you want to with them, really, because all the data is encrypted, and it cannot be decrypted unless that hard drive is placed back inside of the original computer that it was encrypted on. There's also an issue with USB flash drives. This again relates to something more called BitLocker to Go, which I'll talk about later. But these often get, they fall out of your pocket. Just like you have loose change that falls out of your pockets. You can have a USB flash drive fall out of your pocket at the airport, and somebody picks it up and tries to see what's on there. So how does BitLocker actually work? Well, most encryption schemes will use some kind of a key. Just like my sister had a key to her little diary there, we have a key that can be used to unlock encrypted data. It's all mathematical, by the way. It's just a series of complex math. Much of it has to revolve around either symmetric encryption or asymmetric encryption, which means that it cannot be reverse encrypted. So with symmetric encryption, you use the same key both to encrypt and decrypt the data. With better encryption schemes, you use a different key to encrypt the data than you do to decrypt the data. What happens here is there's something called a storage root key, and what this is going to do is it's going to unlock other keys that will make decryption of your data possible. Now, the actual encryption that takes place with BitLocker is symmetric, so that doesn't sound very secure. But the asymmetric keys that encrypt that symmetric key are not. Okay, so there's a series of encryptions that take place here. But anyway, this key is stored in something called the Trusted Platform Module. This is something that appears in the circuitry of the motherboard for many computers right now, primarily with business-level laptops. I have a few other laptops around my office here. Only one of them has it, Lenovo, on my T61. It has a BitLocker key. Some of the other more consumer-level ones, like some of the Sony Vaios that I'm working with right now, they don't have them. I wish they did, because it's a really good feature to have. And now, if you don't have a TPM, that doesn't mean you're out of luck in terms of using BitLocker, because you can still store the key, a key on the USB flash drive. But the thing is, if you lose that USB flash drive, it may be difficult to recover that encrypted volume. So if it falls out of your pocket, you could be done for. Although certainly if you're in something like an Active Directory environment, you can take additional measures to store the key in Active Directory as well, and you can also back up the key using a variety of methods. But what happens here with BitLocker is it encrypts the entire hard drive. It's not like EFS, where you only encrypt the files that you're most concerned about. This will encrypt the entire hard drive, including, by the way, empty space. So that's important because a lot of times there will be file fragments that get left behind in empty space. And if we did not encrypt those, then hackers would still have the ability to go look for previously deleted files or file fragments, and they might still be able to get some useful information out of them. So it does encrypt the entire hard drive, which is also a lengthy process, by the way. It can take hours. When you first encrypt your hard drive and then you decide to boot up the computer after it's been encrypted, then the storage root key, which is stored in your TPM, is unlocked from that TPM as long as the boot properties have not changed. And what that's designed to do is to look for symptoms of an offline attack. Remember, that's where someone takes your hard drive, puts it on their own computer, and then they take ownership and gain access to it. Well, if the system was booted different, if the hard drive was booted differently than when it was originally encrypted, then it knows that there's something fishy going on there. So then what it'll do is it'll present to the user something called recovery mode, and you have to manually enter in certain keys that only the person that encrypted it would know. The unlocked drive, once it's been properly unlocked, oops, let me make that a little straighter. The unlocked drive, once it's been properly unlocked, is fairly transparent to the user. The user really does not see or notice any difference. In fact, I could probably take a user's laptop, run BitLocker encryption overnight, and when they come in the morning, they will probably never know that it ever had BitLocker on it. There's really no difference in the boot up process, visually speaking. And in their daily work, they don't notice any encryption of any kind. It's really only a security measure that works when the computer is turned off, because when the computer is turned on, if someone else were to walk by their workstation and look at their unlocked workstation, they would still be able to access that user's data in any way. So it's pretty much more useful when the computer is powered off. Be aware also that there may be some performance hit, and that's because everything that gets written to the drive has to be encrypted. And because of that, it may take some toll on the CPU, although in my experience, and I've used BitLocker quite a few times, it's really pretty nominal. I think it's partially because we have multi-core processors now, and they're relatively very powerful. And so I don't think you're going to see the CPU utilization spike to 100% because you're trying to write a file to the hard drive. But in terms of full disclosure, you do have to know that it will require some CPU cycles to do this. Now, if you want to use BitLocker, you have to be sure that your system complies with the requirements. One of those would be that you have to have that first 100 megabyte system reserved partition. And incidentally, on some machines, I've seen that be, by default, 200 megabytes instead of 100 megabytes. And I can't quite explain that, but I just wanted to let you know that. You may see partitions of either size. Anyway, most systems, I think you'll see the 100 megabytes. Remember, we talked about this during the installation parts of this series, and that's normally reserved for the boot files to get the operating system going. However, it's also useful for BitLocker. See, BitLocker has to have this because if you have, let's just say we have a couple of partitions. I'll give myself some space down here. You know, if this is my 100 megabyte reserved area that has my boot files and boot data in it, and this is the system right here, if this is all encrypted, then there would be no way to boot from this, apart from this unencrypted boot partition, because this is unencrypted. And that's important, because if the whole thing were encrypted, how would we ever boot the hard drive? So since this is unencrypted, then it will be able to do whatever it needs to do to unlock the TPM and get the storage root key out of it, which will then be able to decrypt the system drive so we can access the hard drive. It also requires a Trusted Platform Module version 1.2 or better, and that's what you're going to find for most of the time. This, again, is a chip that's going to be on the motherboard. It's integrated into the motherboard. You can't normally tamper with it or fiddle around with it. And it is, I don't want to say it's tamper-proof, but it is sensitive to any kind of offline tampering, so that it can often determine that something has been happening to it and potentially lock itself down. Also, there's a USB flash drive that you can have in the absence of one of these, but again, that's just an extra step that you would have to take. This only really works with Windows 7 Enterprise or Ultimate editions, so it doesn't even work on Professional. You have to have one of these two operating systems. And I do recommend, especially in a domain environment, that you have a data recovery agent. Similar to what we talked about for EFS, you can also have one of these set up for BitLocker. And if you prohibit BitLocker using group policy in your environment right from the get-go, then that would certainly be recommended. And then once you're confident that you can use BitLocker, create your DRA first. Once that's been created, enable BitLocker, and from that point forward, any of your domain members that turn on BitLocker, they will automatically have the DRA added to the capabilities of decrypting that hard drive in case some other kind of catastrophe happens, like the keys are lost or something like that. Well, then you still have the DRA that will be able to decrypt that hard drive. And as long as I talked about it, let's go ahead and discuss a little bit more about this BitLocker data recovery agent. The BitLocker DRA is going to recover the drive, as I said before, if the keys are lost, and normally you'll configure this on Active Directory and group policy objects. I would certainly recommend that you probably apply this across a broad scope. And you may also want separate DRAs for your consumer laptops, or for your users' laptops, and a different DRA for things like server recovery. Because in places like branch offices, where you might have BitLocker applied to a Windows Server 2008 Core Edition, which doesn't have a UI, well, a lot of times your servers, of course, are going to have a different level of security than your laptop users. And what you want to do is, by having two separate DRAs for two different kinds of security environments, you prevent the compromise of one of the DRAs from affecting both areas. So if someone compromises my laptop DRA, that doesn't mean that they also have access to my server DRA. Anyway, it's not likely to happen, but certainly it could. Now what you'll do is you'll specify this with a specific certificate in the policy. You'll do this, and you can also manage the BitLocker properties here with Manage BDE, which is an executable that you use to manage your BitLocker volumes. Now, I'm going to show you, first of all, a PDF that more outlines this particular executable for you a little bit more, and then I'm going to go back into a group policy and show you how you would configure your DRA. Here's just the Manage BDE parameters. This doesn't apply only to the DRA. This applies to anybody with administrative privilege that wants to manage BitLocker. This is a PDF available for you up on NuggetLab.com, and I just wanted you to be aware of it. I would take a look at it and just be aware of these pretty self-explanatory options that you see over here and the descriptions. And then I don't think you need to memorize this verbatim, but just be somewhat aware of it so I have a good familiarity with it, okay? And then now let's go ahead and take a look at the group policy object that could be used with BitLocker. Notice that for this, I'm in the computer configuration, and I would set this up on an OU or maybe on the entire domain and link it to that. And then I'm in the Policies Windows Settings, Security Settings, Public Key Policies, and then we would go down here to BitLocker Drive Encryption. This is where we have set up a data recovery agent. Now you see I've already added myself in there. We just click Add Data Recovery Agent, click on Next. If you're in an Active Directory environment, which is what I prefer for this, then you can browse directory, because if you set up certificates properly, they will be stored in Active Directory. And that way you have easy recoverability, so that if somebody loses their certificates, you can always go back to Active Directory to get them. It's well beyond our scope for our current purposes, but I teach a whole session on this in Tech Mentor on certificate authorities and so forth. And then I can just click Find Now and find them specifically, or again, I can just look for my own account. And then there's a certificate for this right here. And that's this exact one that I use to be my DRA here. So I've already done it, and I've already added it in here. Now, depending on the lifetime of the certificate, also be very, very careful. Set up for yourself a reminder in Outlook or some other kind of reminder, I don't know, some kind of an eternal alarm clock or something, that will remind you of when this certificate expires. Because if you look at this is going to expire in February of 2011. Now, time for a true confession. I actually use this in my own environment, and as I was preparing for this particular nugget, I went into my BitLocker Drive Encryption settings for my own domain, and I had 3 DRAs. They were all expired. So I would be totally, what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, hosed. That's it. I'll be totally hosed if I had a BitLocker problem and did not have a current certificate on any of my DRAs. So I got to remind myself every year to renew that. Okay, now once you get that going, there's another setting you also have to have in place. Let me scroll on down here to find it. And that would be in our BitLocker Drive Encryption. Look where I am here. I'm under Administrative Templates, Windows Components, BitLocker Drive Encryption. And then you'll need to go in here to, where am I at here? BitLocker Drive Encryption. And then, I kind of don't have much space here. Let me give myself a little more room. And you'll see here a setting that I've enabled already. That says provide the unique identifiers for your organization. Now, I'll be quite honest, I don't understand why this is a requirement. But what you have to do is you have to enter in some identifiers for the BitLocker identification field. If you don't have both of these filled out, then your DRA does not properly work. Okay, there's a pretty lengthy explanation over it over here on the side, but regardless, I still understand why you have to have this. It's just the way Microsoft has set it up. So you just put in an arbitrary description here for the identification field, and you will be fine. Okay? And then once you've done those things, you're set up for BitLocker DRAs. Let's also take a look at the BitLocker modes you can work with. There's TPM only, which is the most transparent and easiest to use, and the Trusted Platform module is unlocked and the key is revealed automatically, so no user intervention. You can also do the TPM, but you can only unlock it with a startup key, and this would be something like, again, a USB flash drive where the key is on that drive. You have to have it plugged in order to unlock the TPM. There's also unlocking the TPM with a PIN, so the user would have to manually enter in a PIN, something that they know. And you could go to the highest level, which would be unlock the TPM with a PIN and the startup key. So you'd have to have pretty much 3 factors there. The automatic TPM unlocking, but it only unlocks when you have the PIN and the startup key. So I guess it's not that automatic after all. But anyway, you get the idea. Also, you could do it without a TPM at all, and that would mean that, or require then, that you have to have a USB flash drive to store the key. And then you can also manage the Trusted Platform module item with a MMC console. And let me just go ahead and show you that. Here's my own laptop that has a TPM on it. But if I do a TPM.msc, that opens up a console. And with this, you can manage the TPM. For example, you can lock it, you can turn it off, you can turn it on, you can clear it out. So if there's existing key material in the TPM, you can see over here, I could clear it out, for example. You don't need to memorize or be completely familiar with a lot of these different things, but just be aware of the fact that this is the tool, TPM.msc, that there's a console that allows you to manage this whole thing, and you can take ownership of the TPM and assign administration to it and so forth. So that's what you can do with that, and we'll return to this laptop here after a while when I show you more about actually performing the encryption. But for the time being, let's also go to these policies. Actually, let me cancel out of what I've got going on there. And here, the BitLocker drive encryption, you can encrypt data drives. You didn't used to do that under Windows Vista when it first came out. It used to be you could only encrypt the operating system drive. Now you can also do data drives. Then the operating system drives themselves. This is the most common settings that you'll work with in here. And then removable data drives, such as external USB hard drives. Okay. Now, what you can do with this is what I was talking about just now, and that's the BitLocker modes, where you can require additional levels of authentication at startup. So if we enable this, we could, number one, say allow BitLocker without a compatible TPM. It's not advisable because the TPM is a good level of security, but if you have to have it, but the systems don't have a TPM, then you may have to check this box. Oh, also, the TPMs, most of the time, the ones that I've worked with, I don't have to really administer them. In fact, I've really never had to fiddle around with the TPM.MSC I showed you. But in some BIOS, you may have to go in there and enable the TPM before it's available to you. But I'm going to clear that for my purposes. And then configure the TPM. Well, you can allow it or require it. In more secure environments where you know you have TPMs available, you might require it. Configure the TPM startup pin. You can allow it, require it, or do not require it. And these pretty well explain themselves. Same with the TPM startup key, which remember is what you'll put on a USB flash drive. Okay, and then the highest level of security you could go with would be to require a startup key and pin with the TPM. And then if I click OK to enable that right now, that's pretty much as locked down as you can possibly get at that point. Also, the pin is not like a 4-digit. It could be, but it's not just a 4-digit pin that you can use. With Windows 7, you can also add special characters, whereas with Windows Vista you could not. And it goes up to 20 characters now. So that could be quite lengthy there. All right, let's go ahead and get encryption started. Let me just show you how to do that. One way you could do this is to click on the drive itself. So I'm on drive C here, for example. I can right-click there to turn on BitLocker. I can also turn on BitLocker to go, which I'll talk about here in a little while, on a removable disk. But notice that there's no way to do that on something like a network drive or something like that. It's only for fixed drives. Let me also show you how you could do this through Control Panel, because you can see some different things revealed to you there under System and Security. And then BitLocker drive encryption, where you can also access the TPM administration that I showed you earlier in TPM.MSC. So I could do BitLocker to go down here on the removable drive, on the USB flash drive, excuse me, or turn BitLocker on my fixed internal operating system hard drive. What it does is it checks through the system to make sure that everything is in place and that it does have a TPM, for example. And then I can save the recovery key to a USB flash drive. Now, what's the recovery key? Let's say that I BitLocker this whole drive and it's locked down tight. And then I do a BIOS update, or I have some other kind of a system problem that could potentially corrupt or clear the Trusted Platform Module key. Well, now I don't have a key to unlock the drive with. But if I save it to a USB flash drive, then I can gain access to it. You can also save the recovery key to a file by group policy object. I could specify this particularly, so that I might save it to a UNC path or some other destination location where administrators can collect these keys if you want. Although you got to be careful, because if this user is able to save that key to that location, then they can also see other keys. Then I can also print the recovery key, but you have to put that in a safe place for sure. But I'll just go ahead and save the recovery key to a USB flash drive since I already have a removable disk there. I'm just going to go ahead and click on Save, and then I would click on Next. And then you can also run the system check to make sure that there's nothing that's going to be a problem here. And then if I were to click on Continue, it would also restart the computer to make sure that the USB device is readable on boot. Because if you have an older BIOS, for example, that's not capable of reading USB devices on boot, it's not going to be able to do so. Most of them can now. You just have to enable it in BIOS if that doesn't work. But I'm going to clear that for the time being. And then what you can do is click Start Encrypting. And I'm not going to do that because this is actually an overnight process on this hard drive. This takes a long time, and you must not interrupt it. No, mark my words, because you can corrupt the hard drive if you do so. So normally what I'll do is I'll just get this started before I leave for the day, and when I come back in the morning, pretty much it's going to be done, but I'll just cancel this for the time being. Now also let me show you what it did store on the removable disk. Here is the BitLocker encryption key material data, and the actual recovery key information is also stored here. The key identification will identify the specific volume that it is designed to decrypt, and this is the actual recovery key itself. Now what would happen is if I had a problem with BitLocker, then I would probably put this in another computer and then print this page out, and then I would have to manually type this data in from the BIOS. Or not from the BIOS, but before the operating system gets started, it will present to me a BitLocker recovery screen, and I would type this data in manually. Well, having done that, if I don't have any typos, it should then be able to fully unlock that hard drive. Let's also discuss something called BitLocker 2 Go, which is very similar, uses a similar kind of cryptography and things. By the way, Windows 7 also adds now that you can use 256-bit elliptical curve encryption, which is extremely complex. I mean, that's for total brainiacs to even understand what that stuff is, but it uses a certain kind of a sense of randomization involved in it. Very highly secure. Anyway, you can use BitLocker 2 Go as well. This is going to apply to USB devices or removable devices, such as an external hard disk drive or a USB flash drive. I really like it for the USB flash drives because those things are so small and very easy to lose. So I don't really like to do that, use USB flash drives, unless I've had BitLocker 2 Go on them. This only works with Windows 7 Enterprise and Ultimate like the other BitLocker, normal BitLocker does. However, other editions of Windows, in fact, just about any current version of Windows, including XP, can read the data on a BitLocker 2 Go drive. But what happens is, when you create a BitLocker 2 Go drive, it also puts a little executable on there, which is the BitLocker 2 Go reader. And using that, you can then view the drives if you know the appropriate password, and then you can't write to them, though. If you want to write to that data, what you have to do is copy it to your desktop, for example, and then that will be, of course, a read-write copy. But then you can't copy it back to the USB flash drive. You cannot modify in any way data on the USB flash drive with older versions of Windows. Of course, if I'm using the BitLocker drive on a machine that I encrypted it on in the first place, I have read-write access, but these other ones, no. There's also BitLocker 2 Go policies, which I'll show you here in a little while. In fact, let me go ahead and show you those now. Now here I've returned to Group Policy Editor so you can see that there's some pertinent policies related to removable data drives like USB flash or external hard drives. One of those settings is the ability to control the use of BitLocker on removable drives. By default, they have the ability, but if I disable it, then they cannot use BitLocker on those external drives and USB flash drives. I would recommend that you disable it until you have a BitLocker plan in place, and then when you enable it, you can allow them to use BitLocker on those removable drives. They can also pause it. You see, a lot of times when you use BitLocker, like I said, it's an extremely lengthy process, and it may affect system performance for a period of time. Well, you can have the user click the pause button so that it pauses it temporarily if it's using too much resources to do that. Another thing you can do is to forcibly use smart cards. If you have a smart card infrastructure in place, that's definitely a good plan. You can also deny write access to removable drives not protected by BitLocker. This is very much a good security policy to have in protected environments. A lot of classified locations nowadays don't allow USB flash drives of any kind ever at all. And in a lot of places, it's a fireable offense to even have one in your possession, because there's been a lot of security compromises using those things. But in fact, one place that I go to that has a lot of classified data that I contract for sometimes, they actually used JB Weld to seal shut all the USB ports on the computers. I don't know if you'd want to go that far every time, but nowadays what you could do is to just simply use this policy to enable it, and then you would now deny write access to removable drives not protected by BitLocker, so that even if you allow those USB flash drives, they have to be BitLockered. And there's also this policy here to allow BitLocker protected removable data drives from earlier versions of Windows. What this does is it's going to put the BitLocker 2 Go reader on fat formatable hard drives, and that's the executable that allows the user to read this even on, say, Windows XP. Windows XP with Service Pack 2 or greater can read these using that executable. Okay, so the rest of those pretty well explain themselves, so I'm going to go ahead and get out of that for the time being. Alright, so let's demonstrate here BitLocker to go. Here I've got a removable disk, and if we take a look at this, there's some highly sensitive data on here. Some very embarrassing items that could really humiliate me if the public ever knew about these. You see, what happened was, I was giving a presentation at a major university in California, and as a practical joke, some of the attendees during a break were able to get control of the projection equipment. It's really high tech, and someone who administers that room is able to control it from their seat. So they got control of the projector, and they put up on the screen a couple of pictures of me. Well, I did not realize this was going on. And it was during a break anyway, and so I was working on a really nice landscape photograph in Photoshop that was being considered for publication in a major magazine. So they were asking me about this picture I was working on. And maybe I got a little full of myself, and I said, yes, this is going to be considered for publication in a magazine, and so forth. And I was waxing on and on about how wonderful the picture was. And I didn't realize that behind me, they had actually put up this photograph without my knowledge. So here I'm bragging about this picture the whole time. And then they also put up this photograph. So obviously these could be humiliating photographs if they ever got into the public, and fortunately only you and I know about these right now. But what I want to do is to put BitLocker encryption on these things so that nobody will ever know about this if this USB flash drive ever falls out of my pocket, and the secret will be just between you and I. So I'll turn on BitLocker, and it starts this handy little wizard over here. And then what it does is you have to choose if I want to use a password to unlock the drive or a smart card. Okay, if I don't choose either, then of course I can't click next. I'm just going to choose a password for the time being. Hopefully I got a good password in there. And you should use upper, lowercase, number, symbols, and so forth. You know, make it more complicated, just like any good password option. And then as you click on next, you can also save the recovery key to a file. And I can go ahead and do that, or you can just print it out. Again, I'm just going to save this to my desktop for lack of a better idea right now. And then I'll click next and start encrypting. Now, this is a pretty small USB flash drive. It's only 1 gigabyte, so it probably will encrypt in a reasonable length of time. In fact, it's already over to the side of my screen here. It's already 3% done, so that's not too bad. So when it comes back up, we'll go ahead and take a look at it. Oh, and this is what I was telling you about earlier. This is it going on right now. You can pause this, like I said, if you need to, but you do not want to remove the drive while it's encrypting, because you could definitely corrupt that drive. So just go ahead and let it complete, and then when it's done, we'll also see how we can open it in another operating system. And then once the drive has been encrypted, you can see it gets a little padlock on it. For all practical reasons, you might not even realize that it's encrypted at all, because you just use it completely transparently without any intervention whatsoever, unless you've chosen to also use some kind of a PIN or other method. And now then you can also see that I've taken that same USB flash drive and I've put it into a different computer. This is a Windows Vista system. And what we can do with this is when autoplay comes up, it offers to run BitLocker to Go Reader. I could just click that to launch it, but I'll show you with the contents of the drive. You can see here that it has put on that application. And again, that'll always be put on there unless you prohibit that by using group policy. Once I double click on this, I still have to know the password, however. And then I'll click on Unlock. And then from this point, I should be able to read this data. Now, again, I can't write to the data, but I can at least open the files and see them. And it's telling me as much right here as that in order to use them, I have to copy them to my computer. So I don't really have read-write access to this drive. Now then here you can see that I've plugged that same USB flash drive into a different Windows 7 computer than the one I originally encrypted it on. And now if I enter in the password, I can unlock it, and I don't have to use BitLocker to Go like I do in previous versions of Windows. Now I just enter in the password like I would have to do on any Windows 7 computer, and I have full access to the files that are on it. Alright, let's talk here about offline files. This is actually one of my favorite features of Windows, and we've had it through several different generations now, concluding here, of course, with Windows 7. And what this does is it allows us to have network files available even when you're disconnected from the network, because traditionally that's a big problem. I mean, and users aren't always aware of the fact that they might even be working with network files. They're working on an important presentation. They work on it for a couple of weeks. They save it to their laptop. They think, at least their laptop hard drive. Then they get to wherever they're making the presentation and they realize it was on a network drive, and now they don't have that presentation with them. Pretty bad situation to be in. Well, now what we have with offline files is that there's a locally cached copy available for the user, so that not only is it still on the network, but the same exact version of that file is also in a cache on their local hard drive. In addition to being physically disconnected from the network, you could also kind of choose to more or less simulate it. So you could choose to manually work offline yourself, even though you are physically connected to the network. Now, why would you want to do something like that? Well, I do that all the time. For example, I work with a lot of big files, like big panoramas in Photoshop. They could be 900 megabytes. And anytime I make a save or a change to those big files on my wireless network, well, then I have to wait an hourglass for a while till 900 megabytes worth of data gets saved back up to my file server. So by choosing deliberately to work offline, it'll only work with the locally cached copy, and then I get the performance benefit of my local hard drive as opposed to waiting on my wireless network to save it up to the file server. And then what happens is when I have more time, I'll simply work online again. When I'm going out to lunch or something, I'll choose to work back online again. It'll sync up itself automatically, and then I've got a current copy both locally in my cache and up on the server as well. In order to enable offline files, all you have to do is to right-click on whatever it is that you want. It could be a file or a folder, and choose Always Available Offline. If you've never done it before, then it will go ahead and set up offline files for you in an initiation, I guess you could call it. And then from that point forward, it just does its job pretty well. I have to say, offline files really works nicely. And it's a lot better than that old antiquated briefcase that we used to have way back in older versions of Windows. You still have the briefcase, but if you can use offline files, it's usually much better. And then this also is useful for things like redirected folders. So in a corporate environment, for example, when users save their files, that they normally get saved into Documents or My Documents. But that stays on the local hard drive for every workstation. So a lot of organizations will adjust the user account so that it redirects their local My Documents to an actual network share, such as a home folder for the user. The user doesn't even realize that this has happened necessarily. But anything that's been redirected, like offline folders like that, will automatically be made available as offline files. Also, there's issues with conflict resolution. I'll show you a little bit about that here as we go. There could be that you have a file that you've been working with offline while you're out of town, but unbeknownst to you, someone else in the office has also been working with the network version of that same file that you've been working with in your cache. Now when you come back in the office and you try to resynchronize your files with the one that's on the server, it's going to notice that both of them have changed. And then it will offer you a conflict resolution option to either overwrite one or the other or to keep both and just rename one of them. There's also an issue of encrypting offline files. If you go into the offline files control panel item, then you can choose to encrypt them, and that might be useful because then they're much more difficult to view or to exploit if someone steals or finds your laptop. Now, this is not quite the same as BitLocker, and it's not quite the same as EFS, but it does perform encryption on the offline file cache, and it's actually in a folder with the CSC name. Okay, it's the CSC cache, which stands for client-side cache. This is also, by the way, even if you don't encrypt it, it's still difficult for anyone to make sense of it because the files and folders are split up into kind of an obscure method for dividing them all up, and it's not really easy to make a whole lot of sense out of what you'll see there if you look at the CSC cache. There's also GPO settings, and I'll talk to you and show you about all of these things here shortly. Alright, let's take a look at an example of how all of this works. For example, look at this wallpaper that I've got here. This is just a photograph I took from the Desert Botanical Gardens here in Phoenix when the Chihuly glass exhibit was there. Well, that may seem like it's a little bit of a minor thing, but you see, that's actually a picture that exists on a file server. So when I'm out of the office, I don't get to see my pretty wallpaper because, well, I'm not connected to the network anymore. So what I can do here is to go to the background where that actually exists, and I've already created my whole background scheme and everything right here, but it's actually pointing to certain documents that appear. Where is it? It's in the Pictures library, because I'm using the library settings here. It's got a wallpaper folder, and then here's the wallpaper right here. Okay, so it's not only that picture, but it's a bunch of other ones, and I think every, 30 minutes or something like that, it changes pictures for me. So I want to make sure that these are all available. So I'm going to go back here, and then I'll just choose Wallpaper, and I could choose Always Available Offline. There's also, I might want these too. There's some panoramic photographs there. So I'll tell you what I'll do. I'm just going to go to this entire folder, and that will then encompass all the files and folders within that one, just in case I want all of it. So I'll choose Always Available Offline. It's just preparing these for me offline. What it's actually doing is it's copying each one of the files to my local cached folder. And again, it's a hidden folder called CSC. Once that's been done, then we are pretty much it. All I could do now, if I wanted to, if I could refresh the screen, then we'll now see that it has a little green swirl icon on it. I don't know if Microsoft still calls that, but way back when they first started using offline files, they called that the swirl icon. I don't know why. Maybe it's because a lot of the geeks at Microsoft used to get swirlies back in junior high or something like that. But anyway, there it is. Now what would happen here is, if I were disconnected from the network, and I can simulate that again by choosing Work Offline from up here, and if I do so, look what happens. All of these other ones, it'll identify that there are other folders there, but look, they're not available right now. Because I'm working offline, and it's the same as if I were physically disconnected from the network, except that I can work with the locally cached version of these files, but I still have other network access, such as going to Google or some other website if I want. Okay, so I can get all the other access that I want to. And that includes not only like internet browsing, so I still get the benefit of that network connection, but I also get other network resources. It's just this one folder that I've chosen to work offline. So for example, if I go to Documents, notice that all of this content is still available to me. These are all on a map network drive as well, drive H, that's over on a file server somewhere. Let me show you another thing that's kind of cool with this. If I go back into Explorer here, and again back to Pictures, I'm going to work online now. And if I had been editing any of these files, then any changes that I would make would when I click on back online, they will resynchronize. And this happens automatically and in the background, but if you want to force it, you can right-click on it and choose Sync, and sync the selected offline file. So that works out here as well. By the way, don't get confused too much by this thing, the shared folder synchronization item. That's a SharePoint issue for some other software that I've got installed. That's not related to our current discussion. Alright, here we take a look at another use of offline files and how we handle conflict resolution. So, for example, here's my document, Favorite Candy Bars, and you can see here that I'm a real sucker for Snickers, Paydays, and Butterfingers. Okay, they're my favorite candy bars. So what happens though, I'm going to close that up, what happens though if I go off the network, so I'm going to choose Work Offline here, and this would be the case similar to what would happen if I were on an airplane or whatever, and I start to work with this file again, and then I add some other kind of a candy bar to this. Can't really think of any off. Oh, how about a Mars bar? Okay, haven't had one of those in a long time. So I'll just go ahead and add that as one of my additional candy bars, and I'm going to close this up. Now that's saved with the Mars bar in my client-side cache version of this file. However, I'm also, while I'm still disconnected, I'm working on that file on a different computer. Let's take a look at that. Alright, here I've opened that same document on a different computer. Notice that it does not have the Mars bar down there because that was saved to the client-side cache on my original computer. But now I'm going to go ahead and type in a different candy bar. I don't know. I actually hate Mounds, but it's the only one that comes to my mind. So I'm going to put a Mounds bar in there. Now we'll go ahead and save that and close this up. And now when we go back to our original, which is right here, and work online again, we're going to see that there's a conflict that needs to be resolved with this. So here then, when I can go ahead and kick this into action if I don't want to wait for it, I'll just go ahead and synchronize the selected files. And now it says, oops, we got two different versions of this file that were both modified while this was offline. There's this one on this computer, and there's that one on the file server. And it'll tell you when it was modified and some other information like this. And if you happen to know the difference between the two of them, you can work with that. Alternatively, you can also just choose to keep both versions, and it will name one of them, it'll append onto the end of the file name whoever the username is and which version of that change it is. So I'm just going to go ahead and choose, keep this version, and it will now change the version up on the file server, and we're back in business. Alright, now let's also take a look at how you administer offline files from within the local control panel. Now first of all, I got to tell you, this is something that really is kind of a peeve of mine, because there's nothing in here that says offline files or anything resembling that. I mean, you can kind of take a stab at it and say, well, that would be under System? I don't know. It doesn't look like that's it anywhere. It's really kind of hard to get there from here. Well, you can't get there from here. That's why. There's nothing in here that you can click on. You can click on everything if you want. You're not going to find it. Watch this, because this is what you have to do. Go up here to the little arrow next to Control Panel and choose All Control Panel Items. Get that. Wow. And then when you look for what it is that you want, you're not going to find offline files in here. You'll keep going and going and going. You're not going to find it. Why? It's not called that. Instead, it's called Sync Center. You'd think they could have kept the naming of all of this stuff consistent. But anyway, now there's offline files, and then I can right-click on this and to synchronize offline files. You can also set up a schedule, so if you don't want it to sync at any given time, you can say only every evening at 5 p.m. or whatever it is that you decide you want it to be. There's also some properties in here, and when you click on the properties, here's where you can identify when it was last synced and some other things like this. All of that pretty well states itself. Other things you can take a look at here are sync conflicts. If you had two conflicting files, or maybe a file was missing or something like that, those would show up here, and then there would be a link. I don't really have any, fortunately, but there would be a link there that you would click to try to resolve that conflict. You can also look at the sync results that occurred last time, and you can also set up the sync here as well if you want to have some new sync partnerships, which I usually just prefer to right-click on the folder that I want to synchronize and manage it that way. Then you can also choose to manage offline files. That opens up another dialog box, which we see right here. Again, this is nearly impossible to get to unless you happen to know the secret click sequence to get to where I am right now that I just showed you. The other thing you could do is if you click on the Start menu and in the search box, if you just type offline, that would immediately make this available as one of the links that you could click on. But this is where I could just disable offline files if I didn't want to do that, or if I wanted to view offline files. That would show me where all my mapped network drives where I'd have certain offline files that are available to me and so forth. So here's my wallpaper, for example, that I've made available offline. There's also disk usage. I can specify how much disk usage I want to dedicate to that cache. And it's not really too much of an issue unless you're low on disk space, but you can change the limits here with administrative privilege. And then you can kind of move this slider up and down as necessary. And you can see here that's the maximum amount of space all offline files can use, or the maximum amount of space temporary files can use. What's the difference there? Well, the offline files and the temporary files, anything that is automatically made available offline, such as the redirected folders, those are going to be the all offline files, and the temporary files is going to be those that you manually specify are available offline. You sometimes will run into synchronization issues as well. You strange conflicts and things, or you just can't seem to resolve certain problems with offline files. You might consider making sure that you have the files, first of all, and that the files are still on the server, and then deleting the temporary files. This only deletes the files out of the cache locally here, and not the files that you would have off of the server. So you still have them, and then what would happen is the next time you sync, it will copy the files from the server to the local cache here. Hopefully it'll give you a cleaner copy that time. There's also the encryption item here. You could just click on encrypt and it would encrypt the files. It's pretty simple in that respect. And then new with Windows 7 is this network item where it can check for a slow connection every so many minutes. Okay, just another option that's available there. What that'll do is it'll check to see what kind of a slow connection I have, and if I've got one, it'll just use the local cache instead of retrieving the files from the file server. And then we don't need to exhaust every one of these, but under the computer configuration in group policy, and then policies, administrative templates, network, and then down here you'll see offline files. You see several settings related to offline files. Most of these pretty well explain themselves. For example, you could allow or disallow the use of offline files. Maybe in your organization, offline files are considered a security compromise of some kind because people could walk out with a laptop full of network cached files that they wouldn't want other people to see. Well, one thing you could do is to use BitLocker, or you could also encrypt the offline copy, or you could just disallow it like it shows here. You can also assign administratively certain offline files. So you would pick out a folder that you know everybody will have maybe a mapped drive to or something like this, and then you'll forcibly make that available offline for documents that you always want people to have. And you see a number of other settings there, such as the limiting of the disk space and other items that we have already looked at through other interfaces. But that's what we have with offline files. And there's probably more information than you need to know there for the exam, but certainly a very, very useful feature, and something, by the way, that I use just about every day, I think. Let's also take a look here at something called transparent caching. This is new with Windows 7, and this allows you to cache a copy of an opened network file. It's not quite the same, though, as offline files. What this does is it just takes a look at the state of the network connection. And if there's a lot of latency and it appears to be slow, then it will, when you open a file from the network location, it caches a copy locally on your hard drive. And then, if you need to open up that file again soon, it will open up the cached version if the link is slow to the network server. This might be the case over a slow or highly saturated WAN link, for example. So this will help to reduce the amount of network traffic, and in a certain kind of way, it's similar to branch cache, which we talked about earlier, except that it doesn't really have much in the way of administration or configuration. And it's also fairly well automatic. The user may not even be aware of the fact that this is in operation. When you open the file again, though, like I said before, if you've opened it before, it caches it. When you open it again, it checks also the up-to-dateness on the cached copy. And it will still have a connection to the file server over the network. It's not as if that's down, it's just that it's slow. So it'll check the local cached version against the network cached version, and if it's a current copy of that file, then it'll just open up the cached version. If it's stale and it's been more up to date on the network copy, then it will open up the network copy instead. This is not going to be available, however, the cache is not going to be available if you're offline and the file server is not available, or the WAN link is not available, or you're on an airplane somewhere. So that's where you would need to turn to something more like offline files as opposed to transparent caching. Again, this is going to be triggered on the round trip time latency. Okay? And using a group policy object, you can determine what that latency will be. And here is the group policy object. It's in the same place I just showed you a moment ago. It's this enable transparent caching item. And if I enable that, then I will specify the network latency in milliseconds. And I think that Microsoft recommends 60 milliseconds here. So I don't know why they put in a default value of 3200, but they recommend 60 milliseconds. And by the way, this is not one of those settings that will automatically be enabled. You have to go into this policy and choose to enable it before transparent caching will work for you. And then let's conclude real briefly here with power configuration. Now, most of these are pretty simple to configure and so forth, but so I'll just kind of give you the quick rundown here. First of all, you have three main settings. The first one's high performance, which you're going to get the maximum performance out of your processor, for example. It'll use 100% of what the processor is capable of doing if it needs it. It'll also, though, give you a short battery life. So that's something a trade-off that you just have to make, and that's the way it always has been with laptops. There's the balanced configuration. This is the default setting that you'll have out of the box. You get some reasonable performance out of this, but you'll also get somewhat reasonable battery life. So extended battery life, but not quite as high performing as the high performance one. This one might actually be okay if you're not doing anything that's too intensive anyway. And then there's a power saver item. Certainly, this is the one that you want to probably select if you are on the road, because when you're on the road, if you're on a long trip or you're on a flight from LA to Sydney, Australia, or something like that, like my son-in-law and daughter made about a year ago, I think it was like a 14-hour flight. Well, you're still not going to get 14 hours out of your laptop battery, I don't think, but you'll at least be able to get more hours out of it. You're going to get lower performance, but it's going to extend the life of your battery. So to illustrate all of this, let's go ahead and take a look at a laptop with a battery in it. Oh, for crying out loud, would you look at that? 111 degrees here in Phoenix, Arizona. It's so hot you walk outside and your skin just starts to crack like a mirror. It's that hot, folks. Although in February it's quite nice. But for the power settings here, we would go to Control Panel. You can also get to the same thing by clicking on this little charging icon down here where it's talking about my battery. Right now you can see it's fully charged. And then you can also choose More Power Options, which would take you here. And you can also get to the same settings, again, by going to System and Security and then Power Options. And pretty much in the same place. Notice that these are grayed out to begin with. And that's okay. But if you want to change any of the settings, then you can change settings that are currently unavailable by clicking on the button that you saw me click on, or the link that you just saw me click on. And then I could just choose something like high performance. But there might be other settings within high performance that I want to further customize. So for example, I could choose change plan settings, and I could specify when I'm on the battery how long to wait before it turns off the display. But when I'm plugged in, how long to wait. Normally, when you're plugged in, you're going to wait a little longer because you're not really giving anything up. I mean, you're plugged in and you're already charging the battery, so it's not like you're sacrificing any of the power. You also specify when to put the computer to sleep when you're on high performance. So you can change settings that are currently unavailable by clicking on that link, and then you can see here that you can wait, longer or shorter period of time as necessary. You can also change advanced power settings, and this is where with Windows 7 we get into quite a lot of detail that we have not had available for before. But once again, you would also then have to change settings that are currently unavailable, again with administrative permission, so that you can specify whether or not the hard disk spins off after a certain period of time. Not spins off, but spins down. Yeah, so it flies right out of your laptop. So that on battery, it'll turn off after a certain number of minutes, or when it's plugged in, a certain number of minutes, and you get the idea there. And with a hard disk, it does require power, but if it's not currently in use, it'll just spin down and use less power, obviously. Things like the desktop background settings, so that if you have a slideshow going on, like I do with my wallpaper in the background here, where again I've got another picture of the Chihuly glass exhibit. If I want to prevent that from going from one picture to the next, and use a little bit of power in doing so, I can turn that on or turn that off as well. And you get the idea for the rest of these. They kind of pretty well explain themselves, but I would at least go through that and kind of get the rundown of all of those various settings. Oh, almost forgot to show you something. Let me get back into the power settings. Here, I'll just do it this way. I'll go into the power options here again. Notice over on the left-hand side, there's several items you should also be aware of. Whether or not you want to require a password on wake up, for example. Okay, and you can set that configuration right here. By again changing settings that are currently unavailable and requiring or not requiring a password. Likewise, you can also choose what the power buttons do. This is going to apply to both laptop computers as well as desktop computers. It's just that on desktops without a battery, it's just going to only give you one column here instead of an additional column with a battery. And with this one also, you can specify what happens with the power button, whether it hibernates, whether it shuts down, or does nothing. Okay, it's kind of a good practical joke, by the way. You set one up to where it does nothing. Then you can also specify what happens when you press the sleep button, if there is one. I haven't seen a sleep button on a laptop in the last couple of laptops I've had, but I suppose there's still some out there with them. And then what I normally do is I just close the lid. I usually don't push any buttons on my laptop anyway. And then normally what that does nowadays is it puts it to sleep. Sleep is usually going to be a better power setting in many cases than hibernate, only because when you choose hibernate, it also has to write the entire contents of RAM to the hard drive. And then when you power on the computer, it takes longer to power on because it has to go through the entire post process again. Whereas with sleep, all it does is it sends it into a low power state. It turns off power to the processor, but it retains some power to the memory banks to keep the memory banks cycled, so that when you raise the lid again or turn your computer on again, then it charges the processor again, and you already have what you needed in memory, so it pretty much brings it right back, and you don't have to go through the post process. So it's a very fast resume that goes on there. Now, in addition to the power settings, you can also visit the Windows Mobility Center, and this is very useful because for a laptop computer, conditions will change depending upon where you are. For example, when you click on Mobility Center, maybe you're in a conference room and you don't want every time you get an email to get the little dinging sound or whatever it is. Well, you can quickly just mute the system so that you are not a distraction to others. So that's one of the options you could choose. For the fully charged items, if you could just click on that, it takes you right back to the power settings here. You can also choose Turn Wireless Off and disconnect a display. If you have an external display, such as an external monitor, for example, you can connect or disconnect that item. And then you can also turn or not turn on the presentation settings, for example, for a projector. Also, if you go into, and I don't really know if I can show it to you quite honestly here because you have to be in the presenting mode, but when you are in the presenting mode, what it does is it will not turn on your screensaver, it will not turn off your monitor, and so forth, because there's the assumption that you don't want to have your presentation interrupted by a low power state of some type. So when you turn that on, that's when you can work with that. And if you have some kind of an external sound as well, some of these projectors also give you an opportunity to connect some sound to them. When you click on the little picture of the projector, you can also set the volume here. So if you're complaining that, or if a user's complaining that they can't hear anything, well, it might be just set down to low. So you might just advise them of this setting so that you can increase that to a little bit higher setting. And as I was mentioning before, the computer stays awake, the screen doesn't turn off, and so forth, and you can read that up there as well. So that's the kind of setting you could configure for some of your mobility settings, and I'm going to go ahead and turn that off right now. And that's pretty much it. In this nugget, we took a look at mobile computing. We started off by taking a look at BitLocker, which is a great way to encrypt your drives to prevent people who maybe have stolen or found your laptop from being able to determine what the data is, and they can't use offline attacks or anything like that against it. Similarly, you can use encryption on BitLocker to go for your removable drives, such as your USB flash drives and external hard drives. We looked at offline files as a great way to make sure that you kind of stay connected to your files even when you're disconnected from the actual network itself. We looked at transparent caching as a way to improve the performance of files that you might get from a slow WAN link so that they can be retrieved out of a cache instead of being retrieved from a slow WAN link and from a server over a slow WAN link. We looked at power configuration as well so that you can identify the various power plans that are available and where to make specific changes to it, as well as many of the various mobility options. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.